Shalom Alechem. Today we'd like to speak about an interesting topic, and that is the Anisakis worms that are found in the fish. Recently, I posted videos of Anisakis worms that I found in different types of fish, normally in salmon. That's what I buy, but you can find it also in other fish, like whitefish and others. And you find over there long, disgusting worms. Anybody that wants to see them, you can look in my previous classes and see those worms within the fish. And today we like to discuss the matter whether it is permitted or not. It's not so simple that such worms should be forbidden. According to the Gemara and Halakha and Shulchan Aruch, comes out that those worms are permitted. And today, in our generation, the poskim argued there was a big controversy whether those worms are permitted or not, although the Gemara says that it is permitted, but whether this is the worm that the Gemara permitted and the Shulchan Aruch permitted. So it's a very interesting machloket, and I was experiencing with my Rebbe that I learned by for years, Rav Yisrael Belsky Zatzal, this question over and over again. His opinion was very strong that those worms are completely permitted, no problem at all. And he wrote about it in his Sefer Shulchan Aruch, and he kept on saying it in the shiurim that he gave. And I saw the hands-on, first-hand, how we permitted and what was the story behind the scene of everything. And today, we like to get to the details of this halakha and just get first to the source, which is the Gemara. The Gemara says that those worms are permitted, as the Gemara says in Chulin Samach Zayin Amud Bet, Darne de Bisra Sire, the Kavran Sharet. There's a difference between worms that are found in the meat of an animal and the flesh of the fish. The animals would be forbidden and the fish would be permitted. And the Gemara asks, what is the difference? The Gemara answers that by an animal you need shchita in order to permit it, and since the shchita does not help for the fish because it's a different, for the worm, because it's a different entity, it's still alive normally, so therefore it doesn't help on that. But by fish, since all needed is to withdraw the fish from the water, you just take it out, it dies and you can eat it, doesn't need shchita, so that helps also for the worms that you found in them. Now the Gemara says that this is not only a halakha, but also we found a Maaseh Rav in the Gemara, which means what's a Maaseh Rav? We found a rabbi that actually practiced this halakha lemaaseh, and this is of Ravina. He said to his mother, mix it up for me, that worm within the fish, and I'll eat it, which means, obviously, if you find such a worm, it's disgusting, so you can't eat it because of a different prohibition called Bal Teshaketzu. It's disgusting to eat such a worm. So that everybody would agree that you can eat something disgusting. But if you don't see it, or you don't know it's there, or you grind it up, let's say, and you make it into something like a filter fish, let's say, so such a thing would not be forbidden, it is permitted. So over here, you see straight out from the Gemara that such a thing is permitted. This is also how the Shulchan Aruch writes. He writes, הנמצאים בדקים בין עור לבשר ובתוך הבשר מותרים, which means the Shulchan Aruch writes what the Rishonim bring down halakha lemaaseh to say a distinction between where you find that worm. If you find it in the digestive system, you find it in the stomach, such a worm would not be permitted because we assume that the fish swallowed a worm, and since the worm was outside the fish, and it was then forbidden, and now the fish swallowed it, it's inside the digestive system, it's not permitted. Unlike those that you find in the flesh or between the skin and the flesh, that is permitted. And therefore, the Shulchan Aruch writes this also, halakha maaseh in Siman Pei Dalet Tziftet Zayin. He says that הנמצאים בדגים, if you find those worms in the fish, במאיהם אסורים. If you find it in the stomach, it's forbidden. בין עור לבשר ובתוך הבשר מותרים. If you find it in the flesh or between the flesh and the skin, it is permitted. The Shach and the Taz explain exactly what I said right now. He says, the me'alma atu letocham. If you found it in the stomach, we assume that it came from outside the water, and it swallowed it, therefore it's not permitted. נמצאים בהם בין עור לבשר שרי. If you find it in the flesh or between the flesh and the skin, it's permitted. Why? Demehem gdelim. They grew together with it. That was, it grew from the fish itself, and such a thing is permitted. Now, this was the Shulchan Aruch with the Gemara, simple thing, and nobody argues on that. Oh, there's a different opinion of how to look at it in the Rambam, but generally this is the opinion in the Rishonim, Halacha L'Maaseh, and that's one that eats a fish like that, doesn't have to worry that there's a worm inside. Even if there is, it would be permitted. What happened is that recently they found that those worms go through a life cycle. What's a life cycle? A life cycle is an interesting thing. Life cycle means that those worms grew from a female, they were born from a female and a male, and the female lays out eggs into the water, and a small fish eats those eggs, and then a bigger fish eats that small fish, and a bigger fish than that eats that fish, and you have also other types of creatures in the water, like crabs and so on, that eat very tiny, small ones that eat those fish, and then bigger fish eats those crabs, and that's finally, when it comes to your table, you have such a fish, and that worm grew within that fish. Now, since that worm was laid in the water, and there was eggs over there that were laid in the water originally, and it was not at a certain point that the fish ate it, it was not microscopic. Therefore, such a thing could be that halachically is not permitted anymore. This is how many of the poskim want to say, and I just want to show over here a diagram that that is written in the Sefer of Moshe Vaya, Dikat Hamazon Kalacha. He shows over here how this works. This is the diagram that I write. Here we see that first of all it starts, this is the Aleph. The Aleph is those eggs that are being laid. Then small crabs eat them. Afterwards a little bit bigger fish, and bigger than that. And finally you have another fish that eats them. In other words, it goes through a life cycle, and whenever you get those bigger fish and you cut them, you might find those worms that grew in them. But since those worms at a certain point were outside the water, so therefore it's considered as the worms that we explained that the fish swallowed from outside and was found in her stomach, that should be asur. So the question came to the table of the rabbis: how should they deal with such a new phenomenon that they didn't know in the past, that it is coming from outside? So there's two questions over here. One question is this really contradicting what Chazal said? So which means Chazal didn't know that there's such a thing in reality, in the Metziut, and now they found that things are different than what Chazal have said. And if that is the case, normally we say that either Chazal are right and those new things that they found is wrong, or this is what Chazal meant, or do we say that we ignore totally, even if it's a straight out contradiction, we ignore totally what today they found, and we just follow what the halakha says? That's one question. Second question is, maybe it's not arguing in any way, and we're talking about different type of worms, different type of fish. How do you deal with such a question? So, what Moshe Vaya first brings from Rav Palk, that wrote the Machazeh Eliyahu, and he wanted to say that since it was microscopic at the time that the fish ate it, it's considered like it grew inside the fish itself, and that is not contradicting what Chazal said. This is what Chazal said. They didn't mean to say that it grew from nothing inside the fish. Rather, it obviously have to have it's coming from a mother worm, and the mother worm laid eggs that are microscopic, and so then when the fish ate it, it grew inside the fish, and that is what Chazal exactly meant to be permitted. This is what he wants to say. We'll see soon that Rav Revach, in his Sefer Tolat Shani, we'll see soon about that, how he argues on on the idea that of Palk writes, because he writes that he looked into it personally, went through and searched this, and asked the people that involved with finding exactly how these things go, and he says that he found that definitely it was not microscopic. It was such size worm that the eye can see. Sometimes you can't see it very well. You need to use maybe a loop to just recognize it better, but you can definitely see it, and therefore such a thing is not microscopic, and it's not something that should be permitted. In this whole sevara, this whole idea that Rav Balk wrote is not correct. But to continue with what Moshe Vaya writes, he says that he went to ask the Gedolim in his generation. He asked a bunch of Gedolim, and they all seemed to permit it, except the Shevet HaLevi, and maybe also Rav Eliashiv, which in the beginning he says that he permitted it, then he said not. First he said Lemase it's permitted, then he retracted somewhat. It's not so clear the way he says it over here, but he writes the following: כאשר שאלנו דעת רבותינו הפוסקים הלכה למעשה בעניין זה, when I went to ask the poskim, the גדולי הדור, how should we approach this הלכה, נקטו שהיות שלדברי המדענים אינה קיימת מציאות בעולם שתולעים נוצרו בתוך בשר הדג עצמו. They said that since the scientists today say that it's not possible that the worm grew within the fish, it had to come from outside, תמיד באו מבחוץ, אם כן דבריהם סותרים את דברי חז"ל. Therefore, this is straight contradiction with what our sages said, חז"ל said, לכן אין מתחשבים בדעתם. We ignore totally what the scientists say, we go exactly with what חז"ל say, לא זזה הלכה פסוקה ממקומה, ואין לחוש לתולעים הנמצאים בתוך בשר הדג. We don't have to worry about the fish that are within the skin of the animal. The skin, the flesh. And he says over here that this is what he heard himself from Gdolei Hador. He mentions over here a bunch of names: Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Nissim Karelitz, Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul, Rav Greinemann. He sees this also in Shut, She'elot U'Teshuvat Mishnah Shlema, Rav Gross. And he writes this also in the name of Moshe Feinstein over there in Mishnah Shlema. And this is how the Maor Mikloisenburg writes. And he printed all this in the Kuntres Or Israel that comes out in Monsey. This is also a vice that also wrote this way in the Vad Kashrut of Ha'edah Haredit in Yerushalayim, and so did Rav Tuvia Weiss and Rav Padua. All this he wrote in the Or Israel that's printed in Monsey. So there's a bunch of leniencies over here from those bunch of poskim that are lenient, and they write all this, and they said to him all this that we just explained, and he says that the svara to be matir is what he said before, that since the fish itself swallowed that worm when it was microscopic, so it's considered like it grew from itself. He brings over here that Rav Eliashiv went back and forth on that, and Rav Wozner in Shevet HaLevi felt that such a thing should be asur. But he writes over here, very interesting, that in the Rishonim we found things that are very clearly that whenever you have a doubt, you should know that definitely it should be permitted. This is how, for instance, he writes in Or Zarua. He says the following: Tolaim bekavre, those worms within the fish. Barur lanu deminayu gavli. It's for sure 100%. We know it. We're certain about this, that it grew within it, within the fish, which means we don't have to worry that it came from outside. So we see that the Rishonim held of this very strongly, as the Gemara brought down, and this is how the Meiri says: Morna. What's a morna? That's the worm who tolat הנמצא בתוך הבשר. הן בבהמה הן בדגים, ודאי לא מבחוץ באו, אלא משם נטבעו. Definitely they came within the fish, it grew within the fish, it didn't come from outside the fish. So such a thing should definitely be permitted. Now, as I explained before, Shneur Revach, which wrote the Kuntres, the Sfarim, the set of Sfarim, Tolat Shani, investigated this. He went to look for this. He went to ask scientists. He went to see this on first hand. And he writes over here in length, and then he gets the Haskama also from the Gadol, or the Gadol Ador in our generation of Rav Shlomo Amar, also that writes about this in length over here. But let me just tell you, he writes that it's not permitted. And why is it not permitted? He says again, like I explained before, that the worm itself grew outside the water. As I explained before, it was first eggs, and then while the fishes were eating it, it grew into a worm that's a size that you can see. Eventually, when the final fish that comes to our table ate it, it grew to such a larger size. But initially it was a size that you could see, and he says that that's for sure. He experienced that himself. He saw it himself with his own eyes, and definitely the svarot that Rav Moshe Vaya wrote are not correct. So then, after he writes all this, he gets a letter from Rav Moshe Vaya, which is printed in his Sefer, and he writes the following, or Vaya writes the following. ובכן, היות ושמעתם ממני דברים בעל פה, כנראה שזה גרם לאי הבנה, לכן ברצוני להבהיר את הדברים כהווייתם. כפי שציינתם, הרב ווזנר נוטה בספרו להחמיר. Indeed, Rav Wozner says of Vaya, Rav Wozner in Shevet HaLevi writes that one should be machmir, that one should be strict, and it should not be permitted. But he says that when he asked him himself, when Rav Vaya asked Rav Wozner himself, he permitted it. שוחחנו איתו ארוכות בנידון, ולסיכום שאלתי מה למעשה לומר לציבור בשיעורים, וכפי שרשמתי לעצמי באותו זמן, אמר ללכת לכולה, להתיר תולעים שבתוך בשר הדג. When he himself, Rav Moshe Vaya, sat with Rav Wozner for hours and went through the sugya, Rav Wozner told him that it is permitted. And then, when there was a big controversy about the white fish in America, he says, then they wrote a kuntras called Or Israel that is printed in Mansi, and he writes over there that he himself heard from Rav Wozner that went for this halacha for leniency. And then Rav Wozner called him, he testifies, and he told him that after he looked into it again, he should be מחמיר. ואז קרא לי ואמר שזכור לו שאמר לי להתר, לאחר דין דברים נוסף אמר לי מסקנה את הדברים שכתבתי בשמו, והוסיף בעל פה שיש לדון בכל מקרה לגופו, which means not straight out to be מחמיר, everything you have to look into that very fish or type of fish and see what it is. Not always something should be mutar, not always something should be asur. And then he writes a comment, he comments on Rav Revach, he writes that even though you wrote the opinion of Wozner, and there are other couple of opinions that felt that one should be machmir with those fish, but nevertheless, there are a bunch of poskim that I wrote in my sefer that are permitted, as we mentioned before, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Weiss, Rav Fisher, Rav Padua, and even Rav Eliashiv went back and forth on this, Rav Geineman, Rav Karelitz, as we explained. So there's a whole bunch of poskim that felt it is permitted. So at least if you bring in some that are machmir, bring all those that felt that it is mutar. Who felt that such worms should be not permitted? So he writes here, Harav Revach, he writes that Rav Steinbuch, in a tshuva that he wrote to Rav Israel Dov Halberstam, wrote that it should be asur. So you have also some that are forbidden, but majority of the poskim felt that such a thing should be mutar. So Rav Revach answers to Rav Moshe Vaya, and he tells him that the reason he didn't write all this because when they wrote that is they took as an assumption with the svara that you said that it's such a small size, this worm, that it's almost microscopic, and when the fish ate it, so then it grew inside. That's the reason one could be permitted. That could be the reason Chazal permitted it. That's fine. But to say that today, when we know that the reality, the mitzvut, is not like that, it's a size that one can see with his own eyes, definitely everybody should forbid That's the way he writes over here. Okay? That's the maskana back and forth. Now, this is all good to be a machloket between those poskim of how to look at such a thing. It is very, very interesting. But then we come down to what I heard again many times from my Rebbe, Rav Belsky Zatzal, and even wrote it in a sefer, and I like to point it out over here that really the whole thing is mistaken. Nobody ever says that it could be, it doesn't make sense to say that the fish today and the worms today are different than they were couple 1,000 years ago, couple of thousand years ago. It doesn't make any sense, doesn't change. The reality, the way fish are and the way worms are, doesn't change. We don't find such a thing ever to change. Therefore, that same worm that Chazal had is the same worm that we found today in the fish. There's no different whatsoever. So what did Chazal mean? Says Abelsky over here, that what they mean is that although maybe you're right, it was a size that you could see outside, but once the fish ate it, it starts growing within the fish itself. So the fact that it grows within the fish itself, that itself makes it mutar. So you have over here a worm that grew, let's say, 10% outside the fish, and then that's his terminology. And then let's say 90% grew within the fish. So he says, עד שיגיע לסוף גידולו, כיוון ש90% ויותר מצורתו הסופית יוצא מחומר הדג, since it grew 90% from the fish itself, נעשה על ידי זה חלק מהדג ממש. Therefore, it grew from the fish and it becomes part of the fish. The worm now becomes part of the limbs of the fish. And therefore, such a thing would be permitted, behetera gavlan. That's what it means. And that's the reason also that Davina said that to his mother, mix it up for me and I'll eat it, which means Belsky points out that he wanted to say with that don't think that in the future, maybe like this, maybe like that. It is what it is. And it grew inside, but since he came from outside, and the fact that he came from outside doesn't change that fact that majority of the worm grew within the fish, and therefore such a thing would be permitted. He speaks over here very, very strongly. He says that this is what the Torah says, this is what Chazal says, one is not allowed to think differently and to say differently, and it's so much so that we know that the Yam Shel Shlomo brings one that wants to argue on something that it says in the Torah and say that what the Torah says, what Torah means, the Gemara say, what Chazal say, is different today, or it's not true. So such a thing, one needs to even, it's beyarek ובא לעבור. This is how he brings, אסור לשנות דבר אחד מן התורה, בין לאיסור, בין להיתר. You're not allowed to change anything from what the Torah says. אפילו בשעת סכנה והוא בייהרג ולעבור. And this is much worse than eating such a worm. Such a worm is not b'areg v'bal yavor. So even if you want to be choshesh for such a thing, so one is not allowed. That was a Belsky shita. Therefore, comes out halacha l'maaseh that we found a big machloket. Some poskim say that it is mutar. Some poskim say that it is asur. And let me point this out again. Not that if you see the fish, the worm itself, you should be able to eat it, but rather when you don't see it, you try to ignore not seeing it, or if you grind it up that you're not going to see it. Okay, that could be that machloket. But again, you have over here those that permit and those that forbid. And when I show that fish, and it's definitely something that is disgusting to see a worm inside that fish, but at least one should know that this is the approach to such Anisakis worm. Thank you.